Welcome to the polling station with Johnny Ward and William Kedjanyi. Busy show today because it's a timely show as well. We're about a month away from Scotland, Hartlepool, and about a year away from the French election. Lots to discuss with William Kedjanyi, including a bit of a move for a majority for the SNP in the polls next month. William Kedjanyi, how are you?
Very well, thank you, and looking forward to today's show. It's all happening. Everything really beginning to heat up now. Not just here, but also in France, but in all of the nations of the UK. Scotland, things are ramping up. The London mayoral race is ramping up. Hartlepool is ramping up, and so too in Wales as well, which we shouldn't forget. So I think we'll see a lot of market movements over the next month or so.
Yeah, before we came on air, you mentioned the fact that Star Sports now has betting on most second place seats in Scotland. Now, this is interesting. Just reading an article in the BBC this morning, which was written by Glenn Campbell, the political editor of the BBC, and he said that in his mailbox, he counted at least 20 SNP news releases over the past week in which Boris Johnson was mentioned. So clearly Nicola Sturgeon is trying to, I guess, scare voters into, one alternative to Boris Johnson, namely the SNP, which is going to be very interesting for the, I guess, the betting in terms of who's going to finish second to the SNP. And will the SNP get a majority as well, which there has been a bit of a move since we were on with Paul Cushner-Murty last week.
Yeah, there has. You can now get 4 to 6 for an SNP majority. That has moved a bit. I think bettors have consolidated just a little bit behind the SNP. The polls are looking a little bit better for them. I think that might also be a reaction to low polling numbers for the Alba Party. They've hit 3, I think, in 2 polls. One had them as high as 6%. It's pretty clear that they have made an impact, but whether that momentum can be kept is a very different thing. And the extensive amount of resources that the SNP, not just the SNP actually, but even the Scottish Greens as well have when it comes to chasing pro-Indy voters, can't be underestimated. I think also it's worth noting that the Alba Party, if we're thinking about the second place market here, in which the Conservatives are favourites ahead of Labour, the Alba Party looks best placed to hurt Labour and their chances, according to some analysis from the New Statesman and Britain Elects. And I would be paying attention to that because that's looking a really competitive betting heat. And Anas Sarwar has made a pretty good impression, all things told, north of the border since he started there. I think he looks to be an upgrade on his predecessor, whilst I don't think you can say the same for Douglas Ross in comparison to Ruth Davidson, albeit that change took place quite a while ago.
What can happen in the next month if you're going to bet on these elections in terms of, if you're going to lump on the majority at 4 to 6, what can go wrong?
Well, the first thing that can go wrong is another sort of scandal for the SNP. I think, you'd be doing well if, Nicola Sturgeon found herself in another situation like the one she's just been through. But there isn't much marginal room for error. She's going to need to debate really well. It's good for her, I think, that Alex Salmond isn't on the stage. I think we know where a lot of bars will be going. But it's no easy ride. And it is possible, although I don't think very probable, that the SNP are just beginning to sort of hit that fatigue that you do get from voters when you've been in power for so long. I know the Conservatives have managed to deal with it here, but maybe that's the thing that's happening in Scotland. I'd say you need a pretty significant event for them to lose a lot more support, particularly as for all that Alex Salmond is going to be a thorn in Sturgeon's side. He's made it pretty clear he's here for the independence supermajority, something which, again, the polling tells us is a possibility, although not a terribly likely probability, I don't think. And I think for the SNP, it's just about hammering home the message. We're the best choice for independence. You don't want to be tied to the Tory government in Westminster. Labour aren't really fully there for you. Stick with us. And satisfaction with Sturgeon is considering what she's got for reasonably high. She's been First Minister for coming close to a decade. She's also had a fair amount of, let's say, scandals in her time. She's ridden through them. I would think the SNP's numbers would stay reasonably solid, but it's going to be a pretty tight run thing, it looks like, for a majority, and I wouldn't have a firm opinion right now on it.
Do you expect much in terms of punting on these, markets in general? I guess, do punters want to get involved at 4 to 6 and something like that? Or will people take a strong view on the most seats in second place as well? Because I guess that is something that you've effectively a 2-horse race. You're getting 5 to 4 on Labour, for example. You make a good case there that maybe Albert is going to hurt Labour more than the Conservatives. But are these markets that, like, your professional bettors are inclined to get stuck in on over the next month?
Yeah, definitely. I think we'll see interest in all of the May election markets, especially as we get closer to the date. Scotland has already been pretty lively. We have already seen a couple of moves in the last week. I would expect that post debates we'll probably see more punters take a view. That was the case in the general election. The closer you got to the event, the more people begun to firm up their opinions and put their money where their mouths were. I would think that would be the state of play, not only for Scotland, but for Hartlepool as well, and that by-election, although already you do have data out for that by-election, but we'll talk about some interesting messages in that.
8 to 13, the Conservatives, 5 to 4 Labour for Hartlepool on the 6th of May.
Yeah, now a really interesting couple of days regarding Hartlepool for a couple of reasons, because firstly, we had another poll from YouGov for the Times Red Box, and it was for Sebastian actually, and it gave the Conservatives a 7-point lead, with Labour on 42 compared to 49 for the Tories, the Northern Independence Party on 2%, Reform on 1%, the Greens on 1%, and the Liberal Democrats on 1%. Now, that's a pretty significant lead. I'd say pretty comfortably outside the margin of error, even taking into account its as constituency. But interestingly, very interestingly, there are some interesting, I know I've said that word a lot, tidbits in the data. So some people on Twitter, including previous betting people, guest Patrick English, have noted that the unweighted and weighted 2019 vote figures basically imply that the Conservatives would get 49% unweighted, 46% weighted, and that Labour would get 43% unweighted and 47% weighted. In other words, enough to change who would be theoretically leading. The actual result in 2019 was Labour with 38% of the vote and the Conservatives were 29%, but the Brexit Party took 26% of the vote. That appears to have fallen away now. It's possible that this sample here could have too many voters from 2019 who either voted for the Conservatives or the Tories, or the Labour Party, I should say. And it's possible that they could be oversampled. Also, 28% of respondents were undecided and 4% refused. And the undecided rate was much higher amongst women than men. So these are all really big questions, any one of which could tip the balance in either party's favour. I remember now, and I'm sure you'll all remember if you're watching, we had a pretty interesting debate with Paul Krishnamurti.
Sure did.
Paul was firmly on the Labour side of matters here. I was much more inclined to lean Conservative. That poll,
didn't he say Labour were a 2 to 5 shot or something like that?
Yeah, in his view, and I take that very, very seriously.
5 to 4 with Star Sports.
Yeah, given that you can get 5 to 4, there's a huge margin there. If that's your view, my feeling is it'll be a struggle for Labour still, but that poll is something that when you dig down, professionals are finding problems with. So, in other words, a lot of race left to be run in Hartlepool. I also don't think we should consider the Northern Independence Party as just some joke. I say that because it is doing two things. Number one, it's putting another party into the conversation, and they're getting little bits of media pickup, and it'll be another campaigning force on the ground. I wouldn't expect them to get more than 2% or whatever. It's essentially a sort of online party at the moment that has been set up by people on WhatsApp and Twitter, but there is a growing membership, and if they can get attention, they can be a thorn in the side primarily of Labour, and that would be interesting to see. And the other thing I think we should keep a note of is, are there any questions that are asked of residents in Hartlepool that relate solely to the perceptions of Keir Starmer or Boris Johnson? Right? Does that directly correlate? Because generally speaking, approval ratings of leaders tend to be pretty good barometers. Starmer's is suffering at the moment. Johnson seems to be holding.
Fascinating stuff with Joe Biden's plan to revive the US in terms of spending his trillions and trillions, and a very, very left-wing manifesto from Biden in terms of US governments. But let's move on to France. Unless you have something to say on that, actually, just briefly, William. Roman Ganesh had a very interesting article saying that Biden could get away with such a kind of a radical idea because he has such a veneer of respectability, that he's kind of an elderly man. How could he be very hard left, even though by American standards, these ideas are radically left-wing, really? Fascinating times in the US.
It is. I think it's interesting for two reasons. Number one, the US still sets a pretty big cultural lead in sort of policies that can be tried and considered viable. Now, if Biden is able to, I mean, he's already gotten a lot of spending through Congress. If he transforms things like, say, the urban transport network and broadband, and the US begins to get a big kick out of it economically, it changes the conversation, particularly as, you know, an ally nation, one that we're meant to have, well, we do have a close relationship with, is now suddenly spending billions and billions and getting big kickbacks for it. You know, it does change the conversation here. I remember still the headlines of broadband communism when it was mooted by Labour that everybody should have free broadband and that we really should put a huge amount of money for it, and then something forced us to work at home for the foreseeable future. So that sort of stuff just is interesting, and
for sure,
especially also looking longer term. I should also add, Labour and the Conservatives are 11 to 10 for a majority in the next general election, which is an interesting price, because if you're willing to go that long, and if you believe that Starmer's got no chance, he's blown his shot, it suddenly begins to look very tempting, given that the lead for the Conservatives averages about 8 to 10 points, depending on which poll you look at. And Labour haven't led one, I don't think, since January.
Yeah, interesting as well, just in terms of Irish repercussions. Our corporate tax rate is obviously going to be somewhat brought to the fore again, and Biden obviously wary of kind of pariah states such as Ireland. Let's get to France. So it's roughly a year away till the start, first round of the French elections. Emmanuel Macron 8-15, Marie Le Pen 4s, and it's 14s bar, and polling not going all of that well for the far right candidate.
No, she's had some pretty terrible polls, including some awful numbers in Liberation. And also those poll numbers actually look a bit worse than some people would have thought, because only 11% of voters strongly support Le Pen. Now, there are 2 rounds of voting in France. Essentially, you get to a sort of final eliminator round. Still would look more likely than not that it will be Macron versus Le Pen again. Macron, of course, has had plenty of troubles, and France are dealing with a bad COVID third wave, the vaccination program. I know that vaccine attitudes are a bit different there, but it has been a point of contention, albeit for every European country. And of course, he generally has to deal with the distrust that most French presidents do, but he still would look pretty well placed at this point in time. The interesting thing would be if somebody can threaten Le Pen, I think, for that second spot against Macron, then it becomes a bit more, in theory, a bit more of a contest. But at the moment, I'd imagine Macron will be pretty happy with that situation. 8:15 looks about fair, but again, an awful lot can happen in a day in politics in Europe, and we're a year out. But it is interesting to see the prices and to see the polling.
Just finished Call My Agent, the Netflix series based in Paris. I would strongly recommend it to you.
I'll be sure to look it up. I'll be sure to put it on the list.
Yeah, and just makes you, watching this just makes you want to travel again, get back to Paris, have a good croissant, have a nice coffee, and experience French culture and all that. When will it happen, William?
I was looking at the Arc. I think that's becoming more of an odds against shot now.
Oh God.
A lot will depend on the summer, and if that helps matters as it did in some parts of Europe and it didn't elsewhere. I think generally by September we should all be in a better place anyway. We'll have had lots more doses. I think we'll have had time to get past what's happening with the AstraZeneca vaccine, and we'll have more supply on hand. But I wouldn't know about international travel freely to Europe just yet. But fingers crossed on that point.
Yeah, it's been an interesting few days in Northern Ireland as well, for bad reasons. We need to get some United Ireland betting up, sir.
Yes, I think there will be a big interest in that market, and I wonder how people will play it, because one thing that Brexit has done, whether you're for or against it, is it's basically brought independence movements to the fore in each one of the countries that make up the UK. It's not something that should be ignored in Northern Ireland. It's not something that should be ignored in Wales, by the way, either. Now, admittedly, Wales did vote for Brexit. That might put a different spin on it. There isn't that direct clash of voting intentions that you have in Scotland and that you have in Northern Ireland. But interesting to know that the polling for Welsh Independence has gone a bit higher recently by significant margins. And it'll be a big factor, I think, in the next year or so, the independence questions. And not just that, but how do you make independence work? The Financial Times has done some brilliant reporting over the last week or so on the finances of an independent Scotland, but a lot of that same work was done on the finances and trading of an independent UK. It didn't change the result.
Check out the website, starsports.bet. So much going on there in terms of politics this week. We've Hartlepool, France, obviously Scotland, next UK election. And thanks for your time, William.
Thank you very much for your time, Johnny, and hope you enjoyed watching.
And we shall be back next week.